On the evening of July 19, 1940, Adolf Hitler stood at a lectern in the Kroll Opera House in Berlin and offered Britain peace. He called it an appeal to reason. He spoke as a victor, and he expected an answer. The answer came about an hour later on the radio, from a man who had no authority to give it. It was not delivered by a diplomat. It was not cleared by the British government. And it left the men around Hitler genuinely baffled, because in the summer of 1940, almost no one in Berlin could understand why Britain would choose to be destroyed rather than come to terms. To understand that bewilderment, you have to go back 3 weeks to a room in London where Britain nearly made the opposite choice. It was late May 1940. The situation could not have been worse. The German army had torn through France in a matter of weeks. The British Expeditionary Force, the bulk of Britain's trained soldiers, was being pushed back toward a single port on the Channel coast, Dunkirk. Calais fell on the 26th. Belgium surrendered on the night of the 27th. The evacuation had barely begun, and no one in London knew whether a single soldier would get home. Winston Churchill had been Prime Minister for just 17 days. And in those days, inside the 5-man war cabinet, a fight broke out that the British public would not learn about for decades. The Foreign Secretary was Lord Halifax. He was tall, austere, deeply experienced, and until recently he had been the front-runner to become Prime Minister himself. He had turned the job down. Now he looked at the map, at the collapse of France, at the army trapped on the beaches, and he reached a conclusion that many reasonable men shared. Britain should at least find out what terms were available. Halifax had a route. Italy had not yet entered the war. Mussolini might be persuaded to act as a broker between Britain and Germany. On the 25th of May, Halifax had already spoken to the Italian ambassador in London, Giuseppe Bastianini, and suggested that the matters troubling Italy could be discussed as part of a wider European settlement. He was, quietly, opening a door. Churchill wanted that door shut and bolted. His argument was not about courage, it was about the trap. The moment Britain sat down at a table, he said, Germany would set the terms. They would demand the fleet. They would demand naval bases. They would demand disarmament. Britain would be reduced to a slave state, a puppet, dependent entirely on Hitler's goodwill. Better, he argued, to keep fighting while the RAF and the Royal Navy were still intact, because those two things could still stop an invasion. The War Cabinet met 9 times over 3 days, moving between Admiralty House, the Cabinet Room at Downing Street, and rooms at the House of Commons. The most dangerous moment came on the afternoon of Monday, the 27th of May. Halifax felt Churchill was talking, in his own words, the most frightful rot. That evening he confided to his diary that he was seriously considering resignation. That threat was real, and it was lethal. Churchill's government was days old. If Halifax walked out, taking his standing with the Conservative Party with him, the whole thing could collapse, and a new government might well be one that chose to talk. 2 things saved Churchill's position. The first was Neville Chamberlain. The former Prime Minister, the man of Munich, still led the Conservative Party, and his support could make or break Churchill in Parliament. At the start of the crisis, Chamberlain sat in the middle. By the 28th, he had come down on Churchill's side. Fight on. Because of his hold over Conservative MPs, that shift mattered more than any speech. The second thing was a room full of men Churchill went and found on his own. On the evening of the 28th, Churchill called together the wider government, around 25 ministers, outside the inner war cabinet, and he spoke to them plainly. He told them Britain would get no better terms by negotiating now than by fighting it out. And according to the diary of one man in the room, Hugh Dalton, Churchill ended with this: "If this Long Island story of ours is to end at last, let it end only when each one of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground." The ministers cheered. Several got up and ran round the table to clap him on the back. After that, Halifax was outnumbered. The idea of negotiation died in that room in secret, and it never came back. Churchill could not afford to sack Halifax. He needed conservative unity too badly. So he kept him as Foreign Secretary and simply carried on. That was the decision. Not a slogan, not a foregone conclusion. A choice made behind closed doors against a serious faction that wanted to talk. What the public heard was only the defiance. On the 4th of June, as the last men came off the Dunkirk beaches, Churchill stood in the Commons and said Britain would fight on the beaches, in the fields, in the streets, and would never surrender. On the 18th of June, he told them the Battle of France was over, and the Battle of Britain was about to begin. On the 22nd, France signed its armistice with Germany in a railway carriage at Compiègne, in the same spot where Germany had signed its own surrender in 1918. Britain now stood completely alone, and this is where the two sides of the story stop matching up, because in Berlin they were reading all of this and drawing the opposite conclusion. After France fell, the mood across Germany, from Hitler down to the ordinary infantryman, was that the war in the West was essentially finished. France was beaten. The British Army had left its guns, its tanks, and its trucks on the beaches. What rational government, staring at those facts, would keep fighting alone? Hitler expected London to come to its senses. He waited. For weeks he delayed any formal move against Britain, expecting a signal, a message, a phone call. It never came. By mid-July, his patience was running out. On the 16th of July, 1940, Hitler issued Führer Directive No. 16, ordering preparations for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. Read its opening line and you can hear his confusion. As England, in spite of the hopelessness of her military position, has so far shown herself unwilling to come to any compromise, I have decided to prepare for, and if necessary to carry out, an invasion of England. The hopelessness of her military position. That was Berlin's honest assessment. They believed Britain was already beaten and simply refused to admit it. 3 days later, Hitler made one more attempt to make the British see reason, and he turned it into a show. The Reichstag gathered on the evening of Friday, the 19th of July, at the Kroll Opera House, where it had met ever since the Reichstag fire in 1933. Hitler combined the session with a victory celebration for the conquest of France. Before he made his offer of peace, he handed out rewards. In a single ceremony, he promoted 12 generals to the rank of Field Marshal, an enormous batch, deliberately handed out all at once. Rundstedt, Bock, Brauchitsch, Keitel, Kesselring, Milch, and more. And then he went further. Hermann Göring, already a field marshal, was elevated to an entirely new rank invented for him alone, Reichsmarschall, Reichsmarschall, making him nominally the senior officer of the entire armed forces and confirming him as Hitler's chosen successor. Watching from the diplomatic seats was an American radio correspondent named William Shirer. He knew Hitler's performances well, and he wrote that night that the Hitler he saw was the conqueror, conscious of it, and yet so wonderful an actor, so magnificent a handler of the German mind. Near Scherer sat the Italian foreign minister, Count Galeazzo Ciano, in the gray and black uniform of the fascist militia. Every time Hitler paused for breath, Ciano leapt up like a jack-in-the-box to give the fascist salute, clutching a text of the speech he probably couldn't even follow. Then Hitler made his appeal. He was careful to frame it not as a plea, but as generosity from a position of total strength. "I am not the vanquished begging favors," he said, but the victor speaking in the name of reason. He said he could see no reason why the war had to go on. And then he came to the heart of it, the passage that hung over everything. "A great empire will be destroyed," he said. "An empire that it was never my intention to destroy or even to harm," he went on. "This struggle, if it continues, can end only with the complete annihilation of one or the other of the two adversaries. Mr. Churchill may believe this will be Germany. I know that it will be Britain. That was the choice he laid out: come to terms or be annihilated. He mixed it with contempt for Churchill personally, calling him an unscrupulous politician who wrecked whole nations, and sneering that when Germany won, Churchill would already be safe in Canada, where the money and the children of the warmongers had supposedly been sent. To the diplomats in that hall, it sounded dangerous, precisely because it sounded reasonable. There were no harsh, detailed demands read out. It was vague, a broad invitation to be sensible. Some foreign observers in the room worried that the British might actually seize on it as an excuse to open talks. The German press and radio presented it exactly as intended: a magnanimous offer from a victor to a beaten foe. And then, back in London, a man sat in a BBC studio and listened. His name was Supn Delmer. He was a British journalist, born in Berlin, a native German speaker, working for the BBC German service. He had heard the speech live, and without asking anyone, without a shred of authorization from the British government, he went on the air, in German, and answered Hitler directly. "Herr Führer," he said, "we hurl your words right back at you, right in your evil-smelling teeth." He threw the offer away on the spot, on behalf of no one, roughly an hour after Hitler sat down, long before any minister had said a word. The effect in Berlin was almost comic. Around Scheirer, the German officials were dumbfounded. They had genuinely expected acceptance, or at least an opening. As the first cold British reactions came in that evening, Scheirer noted a sense of ill-concealed disappointment spreading through the Germans in the hall. Goebbels and his propaganda ministry were so thrown by the speed and savagery of Delmer's reply that they assumed it had to be official, that this must be the voice of the British government itself. It was the opposite. A single broadcaster had spoken out of turn, but because it was so fast and so blunt, it carried more weight than any careful diplomatic note ever could have. The Nazis did not forget him. Supn Delmer's name went onto the Gestapo's arrest list, the so-called Black Book of Britons, to be seized the moment German troops landed. 3 days later came the formal answer, and the irony was complete. On the 22nd of July, the official British rejection was delivered by radio, not by Churchill, but by Lord Halifax. The very man who in May had wanted to explore terms now stood before a microphone and slammed the door. Hitler's speech, he said, offered no basis in justice and no recognition of the right of nations to govern themselves. His only appeal was to the base instinct of fear, and his only argument was a threat. And then, we shall not stop fighting until freedom, for ourselves and others, is secure. The leader of the peace faction had become the voice of refusal. With no acceptance coming, the Germans printed the speech in English under the title A Last Appeal to Reason, and the Luftwaffe scattered it over the English countryside in early August, over Somerset, Hampshire, and the fields near Stratford-upon-Avon. The British treated the leaflets as a joke. Some were gathered up and auctioned for the Red Cross and the Spitfire Fund, and so the annihilation Hitler had promised was put to the test. Through August, the Luftwaffe threw itself at the RAF. Eagle Day came on the 13th of August. On the 7th of September, the bombers turned on London, and the Blitz began, night after night, over British cities. This was the destruction Britain had chosen to risk rather than negotiate. But the RAF was not broken. Air superiority never came. And on the 17th of September, with the skies still contested, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. It was pushed back and quietly shelved. The invasion never came. The men in that story went their separate ways. Chamberlain, who cast the swing vote to fight on, was already dying of cancer. He resigned that autumn and was gone by the 9th of November, 1940 months, after the decision that may have been the most important thing he ever did. Halifax was sent to Washington as ambassador that December and served out the war. Ciano, the jack-in-the-box of the diplomatic box, was executed in 1944 by Mussolini's own regime. Goering, the new Reich Marshal whose Air Force failed over Britain, was condemned at Nuremberg and swallowed cyanide the night before he was to hang. And Sefton Delmer, who answered a conqueror without permission, spent the rest of the war running Britain's fake German radio stations, whispering into Germany in its own voice. Berlin had asked a simple question and expected a simple answer. What it got, an hour later, from a man speaking out of turn, was the shape of the next 5 years.